We have a lively bunch here today with us in the room, and we have many guests joining us online. Some new and some old friends I'm seeing in the audience. Thank you. Good morning, or good afternoon, depending on your time zone. Thank you all for joining us, either in person or virtually, to discuss the importance of applying a systems approach to planning for U.S. government climate-resilient infrastructure investments around the world. I'm Noam Unger, and I'm the director of the new CSIS Sustainable Development and Resilience Initiative. The initiative is focused on applying lenses of economic security, risk management, and investment to issues of climate change adaptation and resilience across the global south. Vulnerable communities and countries around the world are already grappling with the effects of climate change, including extreme weather and associated shocks and stresses. This is true across the planet and in our own backyard. And our thoughts go out to everyone in Florida contending with Hurricane Milton and others still grieving and recovering in response to Hurricane Helene. As adaptation efforts will continue to rise in priority, making their way toward center stage in climate change discussions, a new resilience-oriented economy is emerging with the development of new investment asset classes, innovative approaches to insurance, and technology-enabled climate information systems, and these are just a few examples. Through this new program, CSIS aims to better inform future approaches and pressing political dialogues at the heart of United States decision-making on global engagement. I'd like to just say a few words about today's agenda. The event will be comprised of several parts. First, we'll hear from Treasury Assistant Secretary La Tortue, and following those remarks, we will hold a panel discussion here on stage that I will introduce and moderate. Following that discussion and the Q&A with all of you, there will be a short networking reception outside this room, and I welcome all of you who are here in person to attend. So let's begin with the first part. As Assistant Secretary, Alexia leads international trade and development issues for the Treasury Department. Her wealth of experience includes serving as Deputy CEO at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, as a Managing Director at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, as a financial inclusion leader at the World Bank, and as Treasury's Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Development Policy, which is where I first had the opportunity to work closely with her a decade ago when she led the U.S. government's efforts on the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on financing for development. We are incredibly excited to welcome her back to CSIS to discuss the importance and relevance of climate-resilient infrastructure in international development. So now, please join me in welcoming Assistant Secretary La Tortue to the stage.
As I spent much of last night trying to reach my godmother, who lives in Tampa, Florida, I was reminded once again, we live in a different world. And so we must do things differently. Good morning, and my thanks, Noam, to you and to CSIS's new Sustainable Development and Resilience Initiative for creating the space that brings us together to talk about a vital issue. Hurricanes Milton and Helene are a vivid and painful reminder of the importance of resilient infrastructure right here in the United States. These hurricanes force us to confront the immense destruction that extreme weather can bring, the increasing frequency and severity of climate-related events, and the terrible cost, human, material, and financial, when we are caught unprepared. I mourn the hundreds of lives lost in the aftermath of Helene and hope for the swift recovery of the communities most affected. Tragedies like these make clear what is at stake when we cannot, or will not, or simply do not prioritize resilience and adaptation. Now, the importance of infrastructure is well understood, so I will not belabor the point other than to stress that infrastructure is the lifeblood of an economy, enabling increases in productivity and the movement of goods and peoples. It is also the lifeblood of communities, enabling people to access basic services like water, and we'll hear from Mongolia soon, schooling, and health services. It is an evergreen priority for countries around the world, including right here in the United States. Indeed, we've seen historic investments in infrastructure right here. And in emerging and developing countries that face the double whammy of an existing low stock of existing infrastructure assets, coupled with, in many cases, growing populations, infrastructure is vital to building a more prosperous, equal, and I would dare say, peaceful future. But as I said, the world is changing, and so we don't need any old infrastructure. We need infrastructure that is climate resilient, that is more than a collection of various assets, a road here, a port there, a dam there. We need well-integrated, resilient, climate-resilient infrastructure systems at scale. Now, I'm really proud of the Biden-Harris administration's commitment to and approach to boosting infrastructure development in emerging markets and in developing countries. At the G7 Leaders Summit in 2022, President Biden, alongside his G7 counterparts, established the Partnership for Global Infrastructure Investment, or PGI. The goal of PGI is to mobilize $600 billion by 2027 to deliver quality, sustainable infrastructure. The United States' share is $200 billion, and we have already facilitated $60 billion in public and private capital towards that pledge. But more than the numbers, what is special about PGI is that it was established in recognition that how we develop infrastructure matters. PGI is designed to offer low and middle income countries a comprehensive, read systems, transparent, values-driven financing option for infrastructure development. In this effort, agencies across the USG, including MCC here, USAID, my department, Treasury, work with like-minded partners across governments, the private sector, and multilateral development banks in a way that I think, is well aligned with the fabulous report that we're launching here today, Resilience at Scale, a systems approach to climate-resilient infrastructure planning. So systems levels thinking has been central to how PGI plans, finances, and delivers infrastructure and associated development co-benefits. We prioritize a corridor approach, and I'll describe that more in a minute, to identify and support overlapping and synergistic projects in strategic and geographically linked areas. We also embed in our thinking that infrastructure has purpose, to improve health, to promote gender equality, to advance digital connectivity. Now, let me explain the corridor approach with an example. But for Hurricane Milton, President Biden would be making a historic trip to Angola in a few days. He would have visited the Lobito Corridor, a PGI priority. PGI is making core investments along the Lobito Corridor that includes rail and road infrastructure between the mining operations in the Democratic Republic of Congo and Zambia, and port infrastructure in Angola. Alongside these transport corridors, PGI is also investing in grain storage and processing hubs, recognizing the importance of boosting agricultural productivity along the corridor, critical mineral refineries, it's not just enough to extract the minerals, clean energy transmission and distribution projects, it's an opportunity to increase access to energy for industry, yes, but also small businesses and households, and fiber connectivity in the communities around the rail, road, and ports, to name just a few examples. So, we have understood that we need to plan individual infrastructure assets in the context of a larger system. Not only because it strengthens the economic case for those investments, but also because it enables the delivery of broad and deep development co-benefits for the governments, businesses, households, and communities that host the infrastructure. This systems core approach to infrastructure development allows for cost-effective deployment of public and concessional resources, encourages private sector capital participation, and enables broad development impacts. And this systems approach, of course, requires thinking about risks, including climate risks, across the whole system as well. Now, we were collectively making good progress on building the resilience of individual assets, say a building, to earthquakes, and feeling pretty good about it. But that simply is not enough. As the Resilience at Scale reports highlights so well, failure to have resilient systems can be disastrous. And I quote from the report, The failure of one infrastructure component can trigger simultaneous failures or a cascading collapse with profound impacts on communities and ecosystems, end of quote. The good news is that the upside of a resilient systems approach is great. Reliability of infrastructure services improves. Economic losses are reduced and cost effectiveness increases. Multiple assets can be protected at once, and progress on broader development goals can be supported. So, what does it take to work differently, or as the report challenges, to work more smartly? First, all actors must embrace this new way of working with urgency. This means all actors recognizing the importance of understanding, calculating, integrating, and planning for climate vulnerabilities and climate risks. All actors must embrace a systems approach, which by definition means working much more collaboratively. If each actor needs to think beyond the one asset they're financing or the one asset they're prioritizing. And yes, planning. We need much more investment in thorough and smart infrastructure planning. This is not just about financing, it's about a mindset, it's about incentives, it's about technical assistance, it's about know-how. And on financing, we need much more financing for adaptation. Ultimately, this requires countries taking control and ownership of their national infrastructure planning so that they work with development partners, they work with the private sector, they're getting investments to help build and strengthen climate resilient infrastructure systems that align with their own priorities. Now, the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, PREPARE, is a whole of government effort that fully embraces this holistic way of working. Let me end with a bit about Treasury and what we're trying to do. Let me start with financing. To meet the energy and infrastructure requirements of emerging markets alone in a way that aligns with the goals of the Paris Agreement will require that these markets secure annual investments of $1.6 trillion into energy transition, infrastructure, and technologies by the early 2030s. We know we can't achieve this with public money alone, and that's why Secretary Janet Yellen has really focused on private capital mobilization through the MDBs as a top priority. Using scarce public dollars effectively requires partnerships across governments, development finance institutions, and the private sector. And the renewed focus on country platforms at the G20, and frankly the interest from countries themselves, I think could be quite helpful in this regard. Partnerships across sectors require increased discipline around risk identification and sharing to determine models that work at scale. Working hand in hand with the private sector has made clear how central strong financial risk management analysis is, including addressing risks like physical climate hazards to our ability to unlock private capital markets towards emerging market infrastructure projects. And given the huge infrastructure investment financing gap, we need every public and private dollar to withstand climate impacts. Countries can barely afford to build infrastructure, and they certainly cannot afford to rebuild and rebuild infrastructure. Let me double click on the role of the MDBs. The MDBs are important providers of both infrastructure finance and climate finance. The OECD found that in 2023, MDBs' climate finance commitments to low and middle income countries reached a record high of about $75 billion, up from $60 billion in 2022. And about 30% of that goes to adaptation. Let me now end with a point that I often start with, and it's not about finance. Development and private finance can only be effective resources for climate resilient infrastructure systems in the presence of strong enabling environments. As the Resilience at Scale report notes, beyond financial challenges, there are real critical institutional, policy, and technical requirements to achieving systems-level consideration and planning for infrastructure resilience. We must also prioritize this work. In conclusion, I strongly believe that the US government toolkit to help countries build climate resilient infrastructure systems at scale is robust and it's diverse. And it's most effective when all parts of the toolkit work effectively together. The bilateral agencies represented here today, USAID, MCC, others like DFC, not on the panel, working in concert with the considerable investment and stake that the United States has in the multilateral development banks and also in the multilateral climate funds. At its core, the report that I all hope you will read leaves us with a simple message: work smarter. And we could not have a better panel to help us understand how to take this very simple message into a very complex world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alexia. The charge to work smarter, and thank you for raising the issues of the complexity, the challenges on financing, the challenges on enabling environment, and the challenges of a heightened level and necessity for collaboration. I'd now like to welcome our panelists on stage, and please bear with us. We're just going to have to move some things around on stage, and please come on up, and we will begin. Thanks. All right, thank you. For this part of the discussion, we're joined by 4 key leaders, and each brings their own unique perspective to this topic. Gillian Caldwell is the U.S. Agency for International Development's Chief Climate Officer and Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Resilience, Environment, and Food Security. Within her role, she oversees the agency's climate and environmental work. Jonathan Richard serves as the Deputy Vice President of the Infrastructure, Environment, and Private Sector Division within the Millennium Challenge Corporation's Department of Compact Operations. As Deputy Vice President, John oversees MCC's climate and blended finance work in addition to several technical practice units: energy, water and sanitation, transportation and vertical structures, finance, investment and trade, and environmental and social performance, all keys to the issues of climate resilient infrastructure. Ingrid Intufshin is the Chief Executive Officer of the Millennium Challenge Account, Mongolia, leading a $461 million water infrastructure project aiming to address residential and commercial water supply shortages through the construction of new well fields, a large-scale wastewater recycling infrastructure, and policy and capacity building measures. Welcome, Ingrid. Adriana Navarro-Sertic is part of the leadership at Miyamoto International, a global structural engineering and disaster risk reduction firm. And that firm signed on to the PREPARE, the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience, the PREPARE call to action to the private sector in 2023. Within her role, Adriana directs climate change adaptation planning and design strategies throughout Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. Welcome to you all. Gillian, I want to begin with you. USAID co-leads the President's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience. And your agency has been helping to lead a lot of thinking across the government about climate resilient infrastructure and more systemic approaches, including this new report that Alexia just mentioned as well. Please start off by telling us a little bit more about that.
Well, just first a little more on PREPARE, because I think this report is really a natural evolution from what PREPARE stands for. PREPARE is President Biden's Emergency Plan for Adaptation and Resilience. It was launched in COP26 in Glasgow, and it's really a whole-of-government response to the climate threats, recognizing adaptation and resilience require a really comprehensive approach. We've been very focused on advancing climate early warning systems, the kind of information that people in the south of this country benefited from in the lead up to these recent hurricanes. Mainstreaming adaptation and resilience as a consideration across shaping all policy and budget design within governments worldwide. and of course catalyzing more finance given the kind of gaps that Alexia spoke to. So proud to have you, Miyamoto, on stage, and Marsh McLennan in the audience, and ACOM and others responding to this Prepare call to action, which has leveraged $3 billion in commitments from over 39 countries around the world. So from this kind of thinking, from this kind of interagency coordination, I'm really proud that USAID and MCC worked with partners in the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the International Development Corporation to shape this new report, which I think Alexia did such a fantastic job of describing. We have to get beyond the sum of our parts and think really collectively about what it means to design resilient infrastructure. For example, you could build a bridge which is designed to withstand flooding, but if you haven't considered the underlying floodplain management, the water over which that bridge is going to pass, no amount of infrastructure is going to resolve that problem. I remember sitting there with the president of Pakistan and his cabinet and former Special Envoy Kerry, and they said the flooding in that country was biblical in proportions, 1/3 of the country underwater. And what was left standing were USAID architected schools, which served as emergency shelter and points of contact for people in the context of that tremendous disaster. And as you look at the video streaming in from the hurricanes on our own shores, you can see that a well-built building surrounded by roads that are completely impassable does us no good because you can't get to the people inside the building who lack food and water. So I think thinking comprehensively about these issues is incredibly important. Thinking not just about the gray infrastructure, the concrete, but the green infrastructure, how we ensure nature-based solutions are really doing their job to protect our environment. And I'll speak more to this after my colleagues, the policy environment that surrounds those investments, which can really catalyze further investment and make for better and more thoughtful infrastructure, or leave all that opportunity untended.
Thank you. Thank you. Jonathan, let me bring you in to fill in the picture a little bit on MCC's work on this.
Sure. No, thank you. And let me just say, thank you to NOAM, thank you CSIS for hosting the event today. Big thank you to Gillian and USAID. You guys have been a tremendous partner over the last, I would say, several years of this effort as we look back. And also want to acknowledge our colleagues from NOAA, Development Finance Corporation, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, who aren't on the stage with us today, but have also joined us in this commitment to climate resilient infrastructure systems. In terms of maybe some background on the Prepare Infrastructure Working Group, MCC has had the pleasure to co-chair the working group alongside USAID. This working group was established under the Prepare initiative that has already been highlighted today. And this group has worked together, I can't believe it when I say it, but it has been 3 years of sitting down, hashing out how one can build on each of the agency's efforts to better respond to climate impacts. How do we ensure that U.S. investments in infrastructure are more resilient? How can we ensure that they provide critical services to communities and also achieve a higher rate of economic return? It's probably also worth underscoring that at the outset, this group really wanted to come up with something actionable and concrete, which arguably is not what one often thinks about with a government working group. Nevertheless, I think we've arrived there, and the working group has come out with some very key recommendations and talked about how we can address a really critical gap in terms of how infrastructure investments are made. Specifically, and as Gillian and others have noted, the need to shift away from this asset-based approach to really thinking about the infrastructure system and making sure that the system as a whole holds together, so that if you've got a school or a wastewater treatment plant, that they're still viable if other parts of that network fail due to climate change. So over the last several years, MCC and USAID have led this interagency process, pulling in a whole range of U.S. government actors and others to really develop a value proposition and best practice guide to address climate resilience at scale. This involved a lot of desk research, significant interviews with global experts, thought leaders. We pulled everybody together in DC for an in-depth workshop to really dig into the details and say, okay, how can we do this? How can we address this? How can we work together to move the needle on this critical issue? And in many respects, the event here today and this conversation and the report, which I think you can all access via a QR code on the postcard on your seats, it is live, has really come out as this is the culmination of the work group's work. And bottom line, it's articulated an approach, a roadmap, made the case that taking a systems level approach to infrastructure resilience results in greater resilience, but ultimately lower costs. So I won't dwell on those linkages. I think we've heard a lot about that already. It's very critical. But I will say that MCC is very pleased to stand alongside all of the others that have made a commitment to looking at climate resilient infrastructure as a system in our program. So again, a shout out to USAID, Army Corps of Engineers, NOAA, and DFC. So maybe taking a step back and saying, okay, what does this mean for MCC? For those that know MCC, I think it's fair to say we have a fairly unique development model. We provide large-scale grants, I'm going to underscore grants in that, to support investments in low and low-middle income countries that are targeted to unlock the binding constraints to economic growth and fight poverty. So our grants are on the order of $350 million, sometimes more than $600+ million going into a single country. And infrastructure investment is a big part of that. As I think the point was made earlier, reliable infrastructure is critical for economic growth. In fact, since MCC's establishment in 2004, we've invested more than $16 billion in 47 different low and low-middle income countries across a whole range of sectors, ranging from energy, agriculture, water, transport, schools, health centers. I think also, as most people in this room would already know, the need for global investment in infrastructure is huge. In fact, the financing gap is expected to grow to $15 trillion by 2040. Some estimates are even greater. At the same time, climate change is really threatening all of that infrastructure. It's threatening communities, and countries confront rising sea levels, more severe storms, more floods, shifting patterns of drought. We're seeing it here in the US, but in the countries that MCC works, they're less able to deal with it. They're less able to afford the measures and steps that need to be taken to deal with that. So I think I'll just end here with a couple of examples about what this looks like in MCC's portfolio, and really do want to underscore the point that our partner countries are really on the front lines. Our experience has actually shown us already that taking a systems approach to infrastructure resilience is critical, and our countries also see this. So you'll hear soon from Enkerl, the CEO and leader of our Mongolia Compact, that taking a systems approach to designing the investment package there has been fundamental to really being able to ensure that water is provided, safe and reliable drinking water is provided to the people of the capital city in Ulaanbaatar. In addition, our $649 million compact in Indonesia also provides an excellent example of how we're trying to take this systems approach really head on in our newer programs. The Indonesia Compact includes a $300 million project that really invests in the institutional and physical infrastructure that the country needs to be able to plan and invest in resilient infrastructure systems. This really focuses on equipping 5 different provincial governments to conduct systems-level assessment and planning for transport and logistics infrastructure, helping those governments develop roadmaps and prioritize infrastructure development based on a systems analysis of climate resilience, and then bringing funds to the table to actually develop those projects that are put forward by the Indonesian government and do what we can to leverage our grant dollars and bring in private sector financing. Lastly, maybe just a quick note on our Mozambique program. $500 million compact there provides a great example in the transport sector. MCC and the government of Mozambique recognized early on in our partnership the increased frequency and intensity of storms and the risk that climate change really poses to that country, particularly in the province of Zambezia, where our program focuses. In fact, just last year, Cyclone Freddy set a record for the longest lasting tropical cyclone in the world. It hit Mozambique not just once, but twice. So Mozambique is again, right on the front lines. We worked with them. We developed a system of road investments that looked at the network as a whole, looked at climate resilience as a whole, incorporated arrangements for operations and maintenance, and also included $200 million to replace an existing bridge over the Congo River, which is, if you go on the bridge right now, you can see, a storm comes in, it is at risk of failure. The water is almost overtopping it. Without this bridge, traffic needs to divert for 2 days additional travel through Malawi. So bringing this in. This is a good example of bringing that piece of the system together to ensure that that transport link is maintained. So let me stop there. I know that's a lot, but turn it back over to you, Noam, and we can hear from the rest of the panelists.
No, thank you, John. It's great to sort of begin to contextualize it in specific context and talk about what this really can look like. And I think we have a wonderful opportunity with Ms. Inkarel here with us to do just that. So welcome. We're happy to have you here in Washington. Can you please tell us about the work of MCA Mongolia and the compact that you lead in response to water stresses and how it connects to these issues of a systems approach?
Thank you, Noam. According to research institutes, Mongolia is one of the 50 most water-stressed countries in the world. And climate change is a major contributing factor to this because, excuse me, Mongolia is also one of the countries most affected by the impacts of climate change. For instance, the average air temperature in Mongolia increased by over 2 degrees Celsius in the last 70 years, which is one of the highest in the world. And about 70% of our land is affected by desertification to some extent. This drives internal migration from rural to urban areas, where now about over 1.6 million people, or about half of Mongolia's total population, now reside in a single city, our capital, Ulaanbaatar. In addition, Ulaanbaatar is also home to 2/3 of all economic activities in the country and accounts for about 65% of our total GDP. So I think all of this highlights the importance of critical infrastructure such as power and water supply in improving resilience of Ulaanbaatar in the face of climate change. So I think it's no surprise that back in 2016, a joint US-Mongolian study identified potential water shortage in Ulaanbaatar as one of the major constraints to economic growth. It was further found that starting from mid-2020s, which is about now, Ulaanbaatar will also face an imminent water supply shortage. The Mongolia Water Compact is unique in that it works to preemptively address the significant risk by constructing critical water supply infrastructure that will increase Ulaanbaatar's bulk water supply by about 80%. So we are achieving that through implementation of three investment activities, three closely interrelated investment activities. So under the first activity, we are constructing new groundwater wells that will unleash new groundwater resources for commercial and residential use. We are also building, for the first time in Mongolia, a state-of-the-art advanced water purification plant that will purify the water extracted from these well fields. Currently, the city uses about 55 million cubic meters of water per year. So around this time next year, when these new well fields come online, we will have an additional 50 million cubic meters of water, almost doubling the current supply. I also want to highlight here that these new well fields are constructed under a heavily industrialized area, downstream of a heavily industrialized area, where for decades poorly treated wastewater has been dumped into the river. So with this activity, we are eliminating these constraints that prevented proper utilization of this otherwise abundant resource to create economic value and to enhance the quality of life of our people. So in addition to this 55 million cubic meters of water, another 23 million is used for heat and power generation in Ulaanbaatar, which some of you might know as the coldest capital in the world. So our second activity, the wastewater recycling activity, aims to decrease the freshwater demand in power generation by using cities' wastewater. So the wastewater recycling plant we're building under the compact, again, the first of its kind in Mongolia, it will further treat some of the effluent by the city's wastewater treatment plant and will replace up to 18 million out of this 22 million cubic meters of fresh water with recycled wastewater. To put it in simpler terms, Mongolia will be able to save about 37 billion bottles worth of fresh water each year. So with the implementation of these two activities, Mongolia will have a brand new water source in the form of recycled wastewater. And also, we will be able to, for the first time in our history, to consciously and deliberately implement water supply and demand management. Now, the third activity under the compact, the sustainability activity, as we call it, it's really the final piece of the puzzle that ties everything together. So basically, in short, what this activity aims to do is first to strengthen the capacity of institutional, operational, and human resources capacity of water utilities to properly operate and maintain these new assets. And second, it introduces a sound and self-sustaining financial framework to enable cost recovery through tariffs. And third, it's undertaking policy and regulatory actions to improve water governance in Mongolia for years to come, and also to enable the government to continue on its commitments even beyond the compact lifetime. So all in all, I think the Mongolia Water Compact is a true life example of how holistic approach towards development aid can really help resilience in urban areas in the face of climate change.
Thank you so much, Ms. Ingerell. It really does paint the specific picture of how it comes together, using, wastewater instead of potable water, for energy and power needs in the coldest capital in the world, and really reversing what you had seen as the trends with regard to water shortages through this work. So thank you for sharing that example. Adriana, you work for a private sector company. How does the private sector link up to the approach described by Gillian, by John? From your perspective, and what are the advantages or challenges of taking the systems approach that we're all seeking?
Thank you, Noam. Well, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here in this distinguished panel. Thank you to CSIS for organizing this. We're so excited to be part of the Prepare Call for Action, which I'm hoping that we'll get a little bit more chance to dive into. Let me just take a quick step back and tell you a little bit about Miyamoto before, so you get a bit more context in terms of the work that we do before diving into answering your specific question. So Miyamoto is a global engineering firm with a humanitarian focus. We work quite a bit on the disaster management response. We tackle everything from the disaster management response cycle. So from assessments to relief to reconstruction to preparedness. And that allows us to bridge the humanitarian assistance side as well as the long-term development side, which is quite a privilege, even from a professional stance, to be part of a company that can have this bridge and have these conversations. We have about 75 years of experience, 20 plus offices around the globe. And we boast a pretty multidisciplinary team now that allows us to tackle everything from housing to urban planning, to community engagement, to policy and planning as well. So back to infrastructure and let's say more of I think we can't talk about just infrastructure resilience, let's say, in the system-based resilience, but need to talk about infrastructure for resilience. Ultimately, we are about saving lives, we're about empowering communities, and about building long-term sustainability. And that requires a very holistic approach. So I'll just echo 3 main points that will for sure, let's say, reiterate some of the points that have already been made by our panelists. The first is that we'd like to say that we focus on what we call a 3M framework approach to infrastructure resilience and system-based approach. This means the first is really looking at multiple dynamics. And Jillian as well mentioned, as well as Alexia, right? There is a dependency on different dynamics here, and we need to understand those, right? From roads to energy networks to public spaces to connectivity, we need to understand how these multiple dynamics come together and what their relationships, what their dependencies are, as well as lack of dependencies. So, an example was given, I'll piggyback on it, right? A flood-prone city, the success of its physical infrastructure, being roads and drainage, will also depend on the natural system, right? Can we protect the wetlands? Can we protect those spaces that allow that permeability and that water filtration to happen? If we solely focus on one, building flood barriers that might deal and solve one solution, but then it brings about a loss of diversity or inequity of services in others. So we ultimately have to think of this together. If we don't think of land tenure, if we don't think of local governance, then informal settlements might be left out of some of the solutions, and then we'll start, let's say, exacerbating some of the social and economic inequities that we're seeing in places. So this idea of really engaging in more of a multiple, understanding the multiple dynamics is the first M. The second M is the multiple scales. resilience, especially linked to climate change, we have to look at the multiple scales, from the scale of the infrastructure asset itself, to the neighborhood, to the larger kind of city and regional approach. So again, we might be looking at a house specifically, and we're looking at potentially raising that house so the flood levels, right, won't affect it. We're looking at rain gardens around the house. At the neighborhood scale, we're looking at how we can interact with bioswales, different green corridors, different open spaces that allow that water filtration to happen. At a city scale, we might be looking at restoring some of the wetlands and looking at this much more as an overall network and system. As well as at a regional scale, supporting more of the overall ecosystem. So we have to look at these multiple scales as we approach some of the resilient system infrastructure planning. And the third is really multi-hazard, and Alexia, you touched on this. It's absolutely essential for us not to simply focus on one hazard now, but understand that it's compounding hazards, right? And we have to look at them together. So understanding that it's not just about addressing the seismic resilience, for example, which used to be our bread and butter, and we've, through the last 15 years, have evolved tremendously from that, to understand that, no, there's also flood, there's drought, there's erosion. With climate change, heat island effect is becoming more and more relevant and of course alarming as well. So we have to start tackling this all together. So the first is those 3 M's in terms of the overall framework for system resilience. The second is really, how do we then equip our team? What are some of the resources then to be able to, provide an action around this? And this, I will just stress that we've really made a tremendous effort to create multidisciplinary teams that can work in interdisciplinary fashion. And this means also a challenge even internally to get beyond our silo approach sometimes and really look at teams that are much more interdisciplinary, that can have these discussions and that can work together. I'm a clear example of that. This is an engineering firm. I'm an architect and urban planner by trade. We work now with landscape architects with the importance of nature-based solutions and really, and even biologists, right? Trying to seek all this different knowledge and perspective to really integrate it together and have a much more holistic approach. And then the third point that I want to stress overall is that we need local action. And I'm so excited to be sitting next to my colleague here. But we do need ultimately local action, promote local leadership. At Miyamoto, I mentioned we have 20 different offices. They're all led by local staff. We've been there. One clear example is Haiti. We started in 2010 after the earthquake. That office is still running, still moving forward. When we don't have necessarily an office, the importance of partnering with local partners, of course, that bring that contextual knowledge, that understand the nuances, that understand the local governance, and can obviously support in a much more grounded perspective around what resilience can mean in that specific context. And that also means, enhancing the channels for knowledge exchange and really seeking to create not just around capacity building, but have a basic and solid understanding around resilience where we can all be aligned, and especially with a system-based approach to be able to tackle the challenges that we face.
Thank you, Adriana. I'm reminded that it's just so wonderful to have each of these different perspectives on this central issue. Gillian, I want to bring it back to you. So having deliberated on the systems approach with experts inside and outside of the U.S. government and having developed this resilience at scale report that really sort of articulates a lot of the different considerations that we're hearing articulated here on stage and more in terms of the actions that donors, countries, development stakeholders can take. What needs to happen next? What will USAID and other agencies now do to fulfill their commitments to this approach that's been articulated?
Well, I think it really underscores the need for a lot more planning and coordination up front, first and foremost, which may not always be popular, right, in the context of the need to move fast, with the demands being on the ground, what they are. But sometimes I think you have to move a little more slowly to move more quickly. If you take, for example, the Philippines, we talk about interagency coordination, you talk about intra-corporate coordination. There were 30 different federal agencies engage in thinking through various equities when it comes to water management. That represents the kind of holistic thinking you want, but it could, of course, be a recipe for disaster without some appropriate coordination. So one of the things USAID did is create a water management authority to kind of aggregate the thinking and synthesize the work and the mandates moving forward. So I think that's critically necessary. I think really making sure that you're doing the comprehensive vulnerability and risk assessments and climate risk analysis up front that goes beyond the individual bit of infrastructure you're developing, as has already been emphasized, to think about the surrounding ecosystem, both in terms of the built infrastructure and the natural environment. Going back to planning, thinking about ensuring you're engaging all the stakeholders, right? Your private sector partners, civil society, local communities, the government, making sure all of those conversations are had, because everybody has a piece of the puzzle and you need a unified and comprehensive way forward. I think also, and this is what makes catalyzing a private sector investment so challenging where infrastructure is concerned, quite frankly. We need to think about the life cycle cost of the investment, right? People tend to think in terms of the upfront cost, right? Rather than thinking about how those extra efforts you make to address the climate and risk vulnerability are going to extend the life of that infrastructure by decades, ultimately saving you money, helping you increase on the possibility that you're going to yield returns. I think also when it comes to the private sector, so much of the Prepare call to action and USAID's work on climate more broadly has been about setting the stage for that private sector investment. What can we do to de-risk those investments? Can concessional finance be offered? Can the DFC bring the kind of risk insurance we need to the table? Are there guarantees available? You don't want to displace private capital where it's moving already, say into renewable energy, but where infrastructure is concerned, we just have an enormous gap and we need to bring the private sector more fully into the terrain. So those are the things I would mention. And just one more point on policy. When we're coming in as donor governments with projects valued at hundreds of millions of dollars, I think taking the opportunity to think with the government about the enabling policy environment surrounding these investments is so necessary. We do need that public investment. In cases where the state and national governments have the capacity to levy appropriate taxes, understanding there may be limitations, to budget for these infrastructural co-investments that are so necessary, to think about green roofs and stormwater management and all this other terrain, it helps create an environment which is going to be more conducive to the kind of foreign direct investment we need.
Yeah, thank you for that. It sort of expands on the point that Alexia was making earlier at the end of her remarks about the enabling environment. I think that's a really good point. Jonathan, I want to turn to you. From your perspective, how do you expect this more systemic approach that your agency is embracing? How is that going to shape MCC's efforts going forward? I mean, you talked a bit about, you brought in the example of Indonesia and Mozambique. In practice, how is it going to shape compacts over the coming years that are at an earlier stage of their development right now?
Yeah, that's a key question. I would say, I gave some good examples. I cited what we've been doing leading forward, but I think it's also fair to say that we're still working on it, and it's still a work in progress. So, as I kind of reflect on that broader question of, okay, now what? What does this mean for MCC? I think I'd highlight three core areas, and actually each of them really touch on some fundamental things that MCC does in all of its work. And the first I would say is, when we start out our engagement with a country, we do a series of in-depth analyses. I mentioned earlier the constraints to economic growth. We do an in-depth economic analysis saying what are the binding constraints to growth? What are the obstacles to private investment? What are the constraints? What are the opportunities? We've started doing assessments of natural capital, looking at climate vulnerabilities and saying, okay, what is this holistic picture and how do we target our interventions to address it? Now, we've been weaving climate into that. We've been weaving climate into our economic analyses and our constraints. But what I think is different now as we look forward is really this systems lens. I mean, we really have been more asset focused. And I cited some good examples of where we haven't, but I think that's, to be fair, a little bit more of the exception, more of where we're going now than where we've been. And so as we look to that path going forward, I do think we're going to see us being a little bit more deliberate in master planning, in a way that gets at the system and not bringing in the climate resilience. And part of that also is also recognizing that the countries where we work often don't have master plans. They're limited, they're dated, and most of them don't take climate into account. As we go through that process, I think we may well see some differences in what our programs look like. Maybe not fundamental, but maybe there's a different piece of the infrastructure system that's more urgent or needs addressing than others. The second piece I want to hit on has actually already been touched on by both Gillian and Alexia, but policy and institutional reforms. This too is also something that's been very central to all of MCC's work. When we go into a country, we look at the enabling environment for private sector investment. We look at what policy and regulatory reforms are really critical and necessary for the success of our interventions, of our programs. And then we build that into our package of investments. As we look forward, bringing in this climate systems resilience lens, I think we're going to want to be more deliberate in bringing that into the conversations about policy and institutional reforms, bringing that in to equip the countries to do that kind of planning, to do that kind of master planning on their own, and give them the tools to prioritize and develop climate resilient infrastructure systems. The third that I'll mention is really coming back to kind of weighing the costs and benefits. And here too, this is a central piece to everything MCC does. We do an in-depth cost-benefit analysis and say, okay, in this sector, where do we get the most out of our limited grant dollars? What are the binding constraints? How do we unlock them? And how do we ensure we achieve a certain solid economic rate of return for our investments? And I think it's fair to say we've been looking at infrastructure systems increasingly as part of that exercise, but not necessarily the climate resilience component of it. So as we get in and we do those cost benefits, there are different costs to bring into that calculus, but also different benefits. What are the benefits of having an infrastructure system, or getting back to what Gillian was touching on, the life cycle cost, the fact that you can put some additional funding in up front and have a much greater impact in sustainable infrastructure in the longer term. And then the last piece, and not to repeat what Gillian mentioned, but I think this private sector piece is really key. This is a big push for MCC as well. It has been. We have grant money that many others do not, and we really, really push and we work hard to leverage that to catalyze private sector investment. Here too, we're pushing to do that more in the climate space, but as we bring private investment into infrastructure, doing it in a way that reinforces this infrastructure systems resilience, I think is going to be really important, and will also shape what our programs look like going forward.
Thank you. And on that third point, in terms of the cost-benefit analysis, I imagine it complicates or further complexifies the cost-benefit analysis when you start to take into account forecasting data as opposed to just historical data to think about some of the benefits or costs. I mean, there was an example. I mean, you talked about it, Inkarel, in terms of the forecasting of water shortages in the case of Ulaanbaatar in Mongolia. And so that would then factor in to your sort of cost calculus, I would imagine. Question for you, looking back on the arc of planning and design for Mongolia's water compact, are there elements that might have benefited even more from a fuller, more systemic approach? And also, how do you build on what you're already carrying out to connect your work to other parts of the infrastructure network that exist in the capital or across the country?
To be honest, I don't really see significant gaps that we're lacking in terms of planning and designing the Mongolia Water Compact. I do believe, however, that soft components that we're implementing under the compact, such as the policy and regulatory actions, capacity building, they are as equally important as the physical assets we're building, especially in terms of ensuring the long-term sustainability of compact investments and the very assets that we're building. Which I think, honestly, otherwise might have been challenging for the government to prioritize and achieve themselves. For instance, as we near the end of the compact, the government is already looking ahead and is working to update the existing regulatory framework that we have to introduce new dimensions on wastewater, recycled wastewater use. Because again, this is the first time that this practice is being introduced in Mongolia. They are aiming to expand the recycled water use beyond power and heat generation, which we're doing under the compact, to other sectors as well, manufacturing of construction materials, irrigation, etc. And along this line, they are also planning to introduce some financial incentives to further encourage water reuse instead of using fresh water for industrial purposes, which I think is extremely important in increasing Ulaanbaatar's resilience, again, in the face of climate change. Also, another example is that the government is also planning to build on the outcome of the compact to address certain pressing challenges that Ulaanbaatar is facing, such as air pollution, which during winter is ranked as the worst in the world, and also traffic and so on. So what the municipality and the government they're planning is to create these satellite settlement areas to decentralize Ulaanbaatar. And they're already working on feasibility studies and detailed studies to provide these settlement areas with water made available by the compact. So I think these are two, some concrete examples of what the government is doing to expand, to work on even beyond the compact.
Yeah. Absolutely. Adriana, in what ways might this more systemic approach on the part of U.S. government agencies, right, and other donors and stakeholders have as an impact on what Miyamoto is trying to do, or even what Miyamoto is trying to do through its commitment through the call to action under Prepare?
With Prepare, let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing. So again, take a step back and then jump to how a more system-based approach can help propagate this. So again, applauding kind of the leadership in the Prepare call for action, and really being a catalyst for us, right, and catalyzing and enabling the private sector to be more engaged and bringing us together. Now, one of the key, I believe, pillars of the Prepare call to action is the effective knowledge generation and addressing critical knowledge gaps. And ultimately, that's what we're doing at Miyamoto. We're bringing in our technical expertise to try and fill in what we see as some of the gaps and potentially create some of these knowledge bridges. Our focus has been on climate resilient housing in particular. What we've noticed is that there's a lot of guidelines and there's quite a bit of work focusing on infrastructure itself, on services, but not necessarily through that focus on housing. So even for governments or even multilaterals to have a very easy, and I don't necessarily want to call it guide, but a very easy reference tool to understand what some of the solutions can be that can be adapted at a household level, that can be relevant in different contexts, that look at multiple hazards. So we're ultimately consolidating a retrofit guide for climate resilient housing in communities. And we have launched an open source challenge to crowdsource, basically, to consolidate different case studies around the world from different organizations in order to form an informal coalition around this, where we can showcase some of these solutions on housing, climate resilience, and community resilience overall. That repository should be live pretty soon, but it's something that allows us to come together for organizations to create more knowledge exchange. So again, back to having more of a system-based approach. How does that help us move forward? Well, it helps us move forward by creating these coalitions, by allowing that these discussions to be had, by creating these bridges with different organizations, as well as creating more awareness and relevance for different stakeholders. Much of the challenge in the implementation from the operational stance in the projects that we address is creating that awareness to the different stakeholders and sometimes local municipalities in order to kind of emphasize or for them to understand the importance of more of a system-based approach. So obviously having the backing of USG and call to actions like Prepare allow us to move forward in a much more efficient manner, right? Being able to back up a lot of what we're saying and again, being able to partner with other organizations who are mind-like and are working on the same goals.
Well, I have probably like 10 more questions that I'd like to ask you, but I'll pick one, and then I'm also going to invite the audience to think about your questions for our panel of experts. This is a question for all of you from your different perspectives. Why is it important for American people and businesses and the economy that the U.S. government is actively trying to shape and pursue more systemic approaches to climate resilient infrastructure planning and design around the world in developing countries? How might you answer that? For example, if a member of Congress walked in here and asked you that question, what's the answer to that from your own vantage points? I don't know. Anybody want to jump in? Otherwise, I'm just going to go right down the line. I don't know how you guys. Who has a thought?
I'll kick us off. Obviously, in the world we're facing today, with the kind of conflict, the intransigent, really horrible conflict we're seeing in places like the Middle East and in Ukraine, just really reinforce the importance of allyship and strong relationships with partners on the ground. And the U.S. government is really striving to be a partner of choice when it comes to these countries, low and middle income countries that USAID works in and that MCC works in, to provide the kind of intellectual partnership, the funding, and the long-term thinking that we need to ensure the stability and growth of these economies. We're also doing work that really sets the stage for U.S. private sector growth and development. For example, when it comes to supporting countries to transition to renewable energy, one of our sort of signature interventions is shaping free, fair, and transparent auctions for energy that U.S. energy developers can bid on to ensure these governments are getting a fair and predictable price over time to build out that renewable energy infrastructure, and U.S. businesses are able to compete fairly in the context of those auctions. That's just one of many examples where U.S. businesses, U.S. employees, and the U.S. economy benefits from the kinds of partnerships we're talking about.
Yeah, thanks, Gillian.
Yeah, and maybe just to kind of complement what Gillian noted, I think it's fair to say we live in a very economically interdependent world. Maybe not everybody realizes that, but I think we've all seen and experienced very clearly, during the COVID pandemic when supply chains break down. When whether you're talking about global food production, manufacturing, transport, shipping of goods. When infrastructure breaks down in one other part of the world, it has a knock-on effect in other parts of the world. Prices go up, availability goes down. So there really is a value in the U.S. investing in the kinds of things we're talking about today in terms of resilient infrastructure. When the system goes down, people overseas, no access to basic services like education, power systems, also feeds right back into everything Gillian just mentioned. So it's perhaps sometimes considered an abstract link, but I think one that can get very real very fast.
The interdependence goes both ways too. It goes in all directions, right? Yep. Because I was just reading yesterday about how last week's storm and this week's storm hitting the southeast of the U.S. actually have affected 85% of the domestic supply of IV fluids. Yeah. That's just by chance of where those industries and factories sit in the U.S., and we're having to look externally at potential sources to, help people dealing with illness and life-threatening situations.
The U.S. is one of the leading sources of humanitarian aid, and as we see more and more extreme weather events of the kind we're seeing growing in frequency and in intensity, the price tag for that kind of aid continues to go up. And Marsh McLennan, who is another partner in the Prepare Call to Action, invests that for every $1, they're an insurer, for every $1 you invest in that preparedness and that resilience, you save 13, right? 6 in the damage and cleanup costs, and a further 7 in the knock-on economic benefits. So it's also just being smarter about how you invest those precious public dollars.
Iqra, do you have a different perspective on this?
I think my answer to this question would probably be briefer than my fellow panelists. I think, Mongolians have a saying that a gift is a true gift when both the receiving and giving parties are happy. I think, systemic approach towards development aid achieves exactly that. Basically, U.S. taxpayers' funds are spent on meaningful projects that truly make a difference in partner countries and the people in that country. At the same time, it's these infrastructure projects, these investments are able to withstand challenges, increasingly more challenges presented by climate change, and also at the same time they achieve foreign policy objectives or priorities that both countries have. So I think it's a win-win.
Yeah. Anything to add, Adriana? Briefly,
Sure,
and then I'll turn
I'll
to
put
the
in my
audience.
private sector hat and just say that obviously this supports businesses, it supports local businesses, it supports us to, let's say, be able to export, quote unquote, our services, but also allows and fosters this exchange that we can have, right, around technologies, around technical capacities, and economic. Win-win.
Great. Let me now turn to the audience. We have somebody who's come around with a mic. Please raise your hand to indicate that you have a question. We've got one in the back there, and we'll group them. We'll take that one, and we'll also take this gentleman all the way on the other side of the room. It's always good to get exercise as you're running the mic around the room. Please, and introduce yourself.
Oh, is this on? Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thank you to the panelists. My name is Jen Rimbach. I'm with Shalati Associates. Just one quick question that I have. I'm curious to learn how your organizations are thinking about innovation and technologies and kind of what is that role and the place for investment in R&D when it comes to climate resilient infrastructure.
Thank you for the question. And this gentleman on this side of the room here also had a question, and we'll take those two together.
Hi. Hello, Brian Lung from the U.S. Global Change Research Program. I wanted to harken back to one of the perverse metaphors that was used in descriptions of the systems-based approach, and that was the corridor analogy that was brought up by Alexia. And in thinking about the corridor approach, I'm thinking when you walk into a corridor, there's something at the forefront of building out this system-based approach. And what is it? And I haven't really heard much about equity and justice being at the forefront of this. And I wanted to hear a little more about this from each of your organizations. Love the discussion so far. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Two great questions, actually, covering different topics, both on innovation and technology and also equity and justice. So I'm going to actually open it up to you. We don't have to go in any particular order, but if somebody has a thought on either one of those questions, please jump in. Who wants to go first? All of you, I'm sure, are dealing with both, actually, factors.
I'm happy to start.
Please, John.
Maybe just a couple thoughts, and appreciate the question on innovation and technology. This is something that we are also increasingly thinking a lot about at MCC, and how can we, I will say, do a better job of really bringing that into our programs. How do you leverage and bring in that expertise of the private sector? And we often talk about the private sector about a source of money, right? But it's not just money; it's expertise. And certainly when you talk about technology, we've got a growing push on digital and on digital technologies, but also across the board, whether we're looking at agriculture and looking at more advanced irrigation technologies, whether we're working in the power sector and technologies for managing and sharing the power. We're trying to be deliberate in terms of how we build that into our programs and provide opportunities, often through blended finance tools like matching grants or ways to kind of bring the private sector into a market they might not otherwise go into, or build it into the design of our programs. We have also been working closely with the Small Business Administration, trying to develop a mechanism formally with them to tap into the various technologies that are actually supported and incubated by the U.S. government in some very cutting-edge ways, and try to formally bring those into our programs as well. I'll be honest, it's not always an easy thing to do, given the process, given our models, given our 5-year timeline, but definitely something that's top of mind.
Gillian? And then
Let me just speak to equity, because I mean, that's such a core value for USAID, and it's absolutely central to our climate strategy. It's one of the core underlying principles. But concretely speaking, what does that mean? It means that we have committed to investing in Indigenous people and local communities. And especially when you think about the climate crisis, it's so fundamental to recognize that Indigenous communities steward a majority of the carbon critical landscape in the world. And study after study demonstrates they do so better than others, even in the context of protected area management. So, and these are communities that are not just too often neglected or overridden in the context of development projects, but in many cases actively persecuted. Many Indigenous leaders are assassinated for their effort to protect their lands and way of life. So Indigenous people and local communities are fundamental. Women, youth, and other disadvantaged groups, completely fundamental. If you want to be smart and strategic and sustainable in your development solutions, you must ensure that women and youth are at the table in terms of shaping those designs. That's what ensures the stick-to-itiveness, the longevity of those kinds of investments. And all of that is at USAID under a broader banner of localization, a commitment to quadruple our investments in locally based organizations, and to ensure that at least half of our investments by 2025 are really architected and shaped and led by those local organizations. It's not a secret that at an organization like USAID and many of the big bilateral donor agencies, the investments tend to go to larger multinational organizations. And that makes sense because, of course, we're thinking about stewarding vast sums of money. There are extensive reporting requirements and project design requirements. At the same time, what can we do to streamline some of the approach while ensuring the responsibility to steward those public resources carefully? Because smart, strategic, sustainable development requires the inclusion of local partners in architecting and advancing the solutions.
Could I just briefly, I would be remiss if I didn't put in a plug for MCC's recently released Gender and Social Inclusion Policy. I talk about things that are fundamental to MCC, and when we look at equity, when we look at social inclusion, this is something we have hit on since the beginning and continue to kind of grow, build, and deepen. It's critical to make sure that when we are investing in the types of programs we're investing in infrastructure. At the end of the day, infrastructure is about people, and we're talking about ensuring that women benefit, the youth, disadvantaged groups. That is a lens that we approach everything with, and is really central to what we do. I just wanted to underscore that.
Just a couple of points. The first on R&D and kind of technologies. Of course, we're like any, I would say, organization, right, very interested in making our work more efficient, in facilitating, the services that we're trying to provide. We are, for example, partnering with other organizations such as NASA. So in post-disaster scenarios, we use a lot of the satellite imagery that they can produce to allow us to support some of the assessments, right? When a building collapses, it's very difficult sometimes to get in or to have one of the engineers actually enter it because it's, life-threatening at that point. So we use these kind of live time imagery to allow us to get a better sense of what the movements are what movements are happening. Is a structure safe to go into or not? So that's one, like really partnering with other organizations that already have a much more advanced technology that we could do in-house, but where we can leverage each other. And then the other one is, of course, trying to, especially when we're looking at these multiple dynamics, multiple scales, really looking at technology to help us quantify a lot of what we're doing, right? Quantify in terms of the co-benefits, benefits, but also in terms of prioritization. So being able to layer these different, let's say, layers of information around, if we're trying to prioritize where in a city, right, we have to put more emphasis. Let's put in that population, right, density. Let's put in the different hazard maps. Let's put in the ecosystem open, spaces to, where's the critical infrastructure? Where are these kind of, service deserts? And let's have all of these together with different weights. And using technology allows us to quantify that very clearly, where we can automatically start seeing the prioritization of different areas, and it allows us to also prioritize action. So yes, very interested and always actively seeking new partnerships and new types of technology that can make our work more efficient. In terms of equity and justice, it's such a great question. And ultimately, a lot of the work that we do is in informal settlements. They're in more vulnerable communities because obviously these are the more badly hit, both by climate change as well as other disasters. I think one of the things that we try to strive on in terms of the work that we do is on the co-creation front. So not just, in part because it allows us to bring all these different voices, right, that you've well mentioned need to be there around, so we can have the gender inclusion, so we can have youth, so we can have, more accessibility and inclusivity in the discussion, but also for the local governance aspects, right? These are areas where the government isn't necessarily present, where the government won't necessarily be able to come in and maintain all the infrastructure services that get provided. And thus there's a very strong process in being able to co-create with the community in order to empower the community and create either the local strategies or enhance local governance strategies that already exist so that maintenance and operation can happen in the long run. Because ultimately what we don't want to happen is come in, support in an intervention, and then, this collapses because it's not appropriated, it's not necessarily being able to be maintained, or the community doesn't see the relevance of it. So I think, yes, that's important in being able to have those discussions and opening, let's say, the platform to be able to co-create when possible.
And thank you for that question, both those questions, because I think on either one you could have a whole session to sort of dig into them. When I think about the question on R&D, for example, I think about different types of research and development of construction materials given new and increased challenges and stresses on infrastructure. But I also think about sort of earth observing, remote sensing data and the ability of AI to enhance the analysis of those data to provide better climate information services that local businesses around the world really need, that farmers really need to be more resilient. So there's a lot that's happening in this space. Let's turn to one last question and then we'll wrap up in the group. I saw this hand go up first, very anxiously over here, so we'll take you, and I apologize to those others, but this will be the last question, but we do have a reception afterwards and you'll have time to chat more about this for those of you in the room. Please remember to introduce yourself.
Hi, thank you so much to the panelists for a really insightful discussion. My name is Rachel Law. I am a incoming, my first day, as a fellow at USAID in the Bureau for Resiliency, Environment, and Food Security. My question is that a lot of these larger infrastructure projects can be quite contentious in their implementing level, especially internationally and in the global south, and in communities that have been continuously hurt by the exacerbation of climate impacts. So my question is what kind of social engineering work is being done to kind of support the very civil engineering or infrastructure design work that's being done to kind of work at that membrane between social support for these kinds of projects and the necessary support that needs to come from local communities and the engineering design work that's being done? Thank you.
Thank you for the question and welcome to your first day of your fellowship at USAID. It's great. Everyone should go work for USAID. I say as a former two-time USAID employee. So this is a great question for us to sort of wrap into maybe some final comments as well as we go across our panel. I think I'll add to it just that we've talked about this system's more holistic approach just requires a whole level change in terms of collaboration, which to your point can sometimes slow things down, but also make things better over the long term. I think the question also connects to that in terms of focusing on the social support needed to ensure the sustainability and the success of climate resilient infrastructure investments. So, how do we get there? Do we have the tools that we need? Do we need to invest differently in tools to do this better, to do what our questioner is asking better? Let me just go down the line and we'll wrap up that way. Gillian.
I think we've touched on the need for that consultation and co-creation from the very beginning so that your investments are really meeting the needs of communities. Going back to the bridge I started with and the floodplain surrounding it, is there a bicycle lane that's necessary to reduce vehicular traffic and emissions? What about roadside stands for shopkeepers who are actually trying to sell their goods along the road? How are we going to address air pollution and the sustainability of that infrastructure for the people in the floodplain? How are we going to think about their continued access to the biodiversity they depend on to survive, as well as their ability to farm and fish in the area? So looking at all of the assets, the natural and physical assets, as a system that is deeply interrelated and that connects to people and nature, and that needs to be informed by people and their perspectives, as well as nature and its needs and possibilities.
And I think that speaks to the interdisciplinary approach that Adriana brought in as well, which gets to the sort of the social side of these sort of hard infrastructure projects. John.
Yeah, so maybe a few thoughts. I mean, you think about where to go from here and how to make this work. And maybe first, just to touch directly at the question, and I feel like I've said a number of times something that's fundamental to MCC, but one piece I haven't touched on yet that is fundamental to MCC is what we call country ownership. And that is something that is central in everything we do. We do it in partnership with our partner countries. That starts at the very beginning when we talk about what's the sector, what are the needs, highly engaged at all levels of national government, even down to communities when we start shaping what an actual investment is. So this, our programs are owned by, are developed by and with our country partners, and in fact, they're the ones that implement them and do them. So I think that helps ensure that the stuff we support is owned and supported at that lower level. Now, coming back to your bigger question, I mean, we've touched on coordination. I think you'll even see in the commitments that we've made about sharing information and new data and tools. I think that's all relevant here. I spoke a lot about the working group and the government coordination, but it's got to be broader than that. It's bringing in the private sector. It's bringing in other actors, NGOs. There's a lot of other information out there. The insurance industry is on the front lines of climate change. They've got the math. They've got the statistics. We're working with NOAA in our partnership with some of the best climate data. So, developing that data, sharing the data. I do think we're looking at new tools and approaches. I referred earlier to some of the things MCC is grappling with. I have no doubt we will continue to grapple with that. Also want to learn from others. And then maybe just a final point, and we've also touched on this, but financing. I think, it's very clear. I think we've tried to make the case that an investment upfront in resilient infrastructure pays dividends in the longer term in terms of life cycle cost, in terms of paying for damage. But generally speaking, it costs more on the front end. And how do you mobilize those funds? And I think it's going to be a combination of private sector and government donors, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I just want to echo Jonathan's statement here. In terms of country ownership and involvement by the partner country, throughout all stages, starting from compact development, where we decide, what sector to invest, which projects to implement, on-hands involvement at all stages and at all levels by the government, and not only the government, the private sector, the experts, practitioners, academics, all alike. These kind of extensive dialogues go a long way to ensure that the country actually owns the project and stays accountable and responsible through implementation. So I think it goes a long way. And about coordination and collaboration, I couldn't agree more. I think most of the countries, if not all, that partner with donors are developing countries. They, it's common for these countries to lack necessary expertise, resources to systematically design and plan for these complex projects, to effectively execute them, and to ensure their long-term sustainability in the long run. So I think this kind of coordination, collaboration between different stakeholders, although they might have different agendas, different priorities, but for them to collaborate and coordinate effectively towards the same goal, I think it can make a mile of difference.
Thank you.
I'll just complement by saying, there are various frameworks on system-based approach to infrastructure, and I think it's not necessarily about reinventing the wheel. A lot of the multilaterals, World Bank, ADB, even C40 has wonderful resources. Where we see the challenge many times is from kind of that discourse and the conceptualization to the actual implementation on the ground. And many times this also happens because of an existing funding issue, right, where funding is still coming very much in silos and not necessarily bridging different different departments. Also in terms of the actual implementation, where we see the siloed approach or maybe a different type of institutional framework that exists locally that doesn't necessarily allow this interdisciplinary, let's say, approach and more systems-based approach to happen for the coordination amongst agencies, et cetera. So I think one of the emphasis that we need to place is to figure out from a policy perspective and also knowledge exchange perspective how to start bridging some of these gaps. One other point that I wanted to make on the R&D, as you mentioned, new technologies, was also the fact that we're now going back to understanding and leveraging and supporting much more on the vernacular side too, right? So existing, bamboo, earth construction, all these local sustainable materials and technologies that for so long also got ignored because modernity was concrete, let's say. We're now going back to them, right? We're understanding that they provide tremendous support and that we need to leverage them. And again, it goes back to also enhancing some of the social justice and equity in communities. So I just wanted to stress that point. And I'll just finalize by saying that the need is so great. Obviously, financing is a critical component of it, but this is a compounding challenge, right? It's not just a crisis challenge, it's a migration challenge, it's a humanitarian crisis, globally speaking. And what we see is that this does demand a new approach to how we are developing infrastructure, how we're thinking about infrastructure, but also, on the private sector side, we need more purpose-driven let's say, private sector engagement. So it's not just on the financing, but really leveraging about what you can do and how we can work together on this.
Well, thank you. This has been a tremendous discussion, and it is built upon tremendous work, including the report by various agencies of the U.S. government led by MCC and USAID. I want to thank our expert panelists. I want to thank Alexia Latortue from Treasury. I want to make sure I also thank Madeline McLean from my team, who's here in the room, and CSIS's conferencing and audio and visual support teams for pulling this together. And I also want to thank some colleagues from the U.S. government side as well. This event wouldn't have happened without tremendous cooperation, especially from Amy Swears from USAID, Hope Heron from MCC. Thank you so much. Thanks for your continued leadership on this set of issues and on climate resilient infrastructure issues. We hope to have many of you join us here again 2 weeks from today at CSIS. We're going to host Senior Climate Advisor to President Biden, John Podesta, along with Brazil's Secretary Ambassador Correa de Lago, and a stellar lineup of other global leaders on the margins of the Bank IMF meetings and in the run-up to COP29 and the upcoming G20 meetings in Brazil. So I want to close this out and invite all of you who are here in the room. I want to close out our live stream and invite all of you who are here in the room to join us for a reception just outside this room. But I also want to make sure to invite Alexia Latortue and some others from the U.S. government, Amy and Hope and Lindsay Doyle, Meredith Ryder-Rude, co-directors of Prepare, Aparna Srivastava from Development Finance Corporation. There are a whole host of leaders across the U.S. government on the President's emergency plan for adaptation and resilience. And I'd like to welcome all of you up on stage for a group photo after we take off our mics, and then we'll join everybody for the reception. Thank you.